This chapter is called Escape. The leader was clearly angry over what had happened. Oh, that's right. They just had a close encounter with that big bull, they called it, the male elephant. He called his men over to him and spoke sharply to them, pointing to where the herd had been to underline his words. They all knew the elephants would move quickly now that they had scented danger, and it would be difficult to catch up with the herd. For a few minutes, the leader seemed uncertain what to do. Then he spoke. "We'll follow them. I want to get those tusks." One of the men stepped forward. "But they're going west. There are rangers that way. It would be too dangerous. They might—" The leader interrupted him abruptly. "I want those tusks. If you're frightened, you can go home now." The men looked down. "I'm not frightened." Akimbo listened. The possibility of traveling west excited him. In that direction lay the ranger camp and home, and this would make it easier for him to carry out his plan. With the tracker in front, his eyes glued to the ground, a line of poachers snaked its way through the thick savanna. Tracking elephants was much easier than tracking other animals, since elephants destroy so much as they make their way, but even so, it took all the tracker's skill. By late afternoon, there was still no sign of the elephants, and Akimbo wondered what they would do when darkness fell. It would be impossible to follow the herd any farther, and dangerous too, as they could suddenly find themselves in the middle of the herd in the darkness, and they would stand no chance then. When the light became too bad to go on, the leader called his men to a halt. Everybody was tense, weary, and thirsty, and they were pleased to be able to rest. "We will spend the night here. At first light, we can go on." "But we're too close to the ranger camp," one of the others said. "It's only 1 or 2 hours that way." Akimbo looked where the man pointed. Then, without bothering to hear the leader's answer, he walked off and lay beneath a nearby bush, curling up as if to fall asleep. The other men all settled themselves too, concealing themselves beneath branches or bushes, and soon anybody walking past would not have realized that 5 men and a boy were sleeping there. But the boy was not asleep. Although his bones ached with tiredness, Akimbo fought back the waves of drowsiness, and he struggled to keep his mind on what he had to do. At last, when he was sure that all the others were fast asleep, he crept out from underneath his sheltering place. Nobody moved, nor did anybody stir, as he began to move off in the direction of the ranger camp, which one of the men had pointed out. "I hope he was right," he said to himself. "If he's not—" But Akimbo did not allow himself to think about that. For the moment he knew exactly what he had to do, and he concentrated all his energy on doing it. It was more frightening than Akimbo could ever have imagined. The moon was behind a cloud, and there was very little light. All that he could make out around him were large black shapes, the shapes of trees, bushes, rocks. Akimbo tried to fix his mind on something. Akimbo tried to fix his mind on some landmark in order to keep traveling in the right direction, but it was almost impossible to do this in the darkness. The shape that he aimed for would suddenly be lost or would look different when he approached it, and there would be no way of telling that he was not going around in one large circle. Have you ever been out in the dark when it was so dark that you couldn't hardly see what was in front of you? "If I'm just going around and around, I'll come back to where I started from, and I'll walk right into the poachers." After about 15 minutes, the clouds cleared and there was a little more light from the sky. Akimbo could now identify an object to aim for in the distance. He could also move faster, as he did not have to worry so much about the ground suddenly giving way over a cliff. He broke into a run. It was painful to his tired legs, but he managed to push himself. He scratched himself, of course, on thorn bushes and protruding twigs, but he did not mind that. All he wanted now was to reach the ranger camp and safety. Suddenly, Akimbo stopped. His heart was pounding within him, his skin prickling with fear. Had his ears deceived him? Or was it— Yes, there it was again. It was a roar, still quite distant, but unmistakably the roar of a lion. Akimbo looked around him in panic. All he saw were the same dark shapes and shadows of the African night. Lions could be anywhere. They could be watching him at this moment. They could be crouched, ready to pounce. He shook his head. He would not give up now. He would not look for the nearest tree and try to climb to safety. He had to get home. This chapter is called Rhino Charge. Moving as quietly as he could, Akimbo made his way through the thick scrub bush. It was difficult to travel quietly unless he also went slowly, and if he went slowly, that would make him more likely to be attacked. He stopped for a moment and listened. The African night is never quiet. There was the sound of insects, a shrill screeching noise that never stopped. It was everywhere, behind him, around him, above him, and it was difficult to make out any other sound. That reminds me of the story we read called The Jungle Drum. That one time, remember that? Yet, there it was. There was a sound that was different. Akimbo took a deep breath. For a few seconds he felt like shouting out, in the hope that somebody might hear him, but he knew that there was nobody about, and shouting could make his situation even worse. He turned around. Did the sound come from behind? There was silence. Akimbo took another step and then stopped again. He was sure that he had heard something. I'm being stalked. That means it's a lion, or maybe a leopard. The thought of the fierce animal behind him made his skin chill. He looked around for a tree, and he saw a few yards away in the darkness. I can climb that. It's not high, but at least it'll give me some protection. Slowly he moved over to the tree and reached up for the first lower branches. His arms were weak with fear, but he still felt strong enough to pull himself up off the ground. Then, just as he began to raise himself, he heard a crashing sound beneath him. Fear made him let go, and he dropped down in a heap. The wind knocked out of him. The crashing noise grew louder as the animal charged through the undergrowth. Akimbo tried to struggle to his feet, but his limbs would not respond. He was paralyzed with fright. The rhino moved with extraordinary speed. When Akimbo first saw it, it was a dark blur heading straight toward him, and then, in no more than a few seconds, it had shot past, thundering off beyond the tree. Akimbo stayed immobile as the rhino moved off, then the crashing sound grew fainter, and after a while there was quiet again. Akimbo picked himself up and found, to his surprise, that he was unhurt. The rhino must have missed him by inches. He started to walk again, dazed, overwhelmed by the closeness of his escape. He realized that he must have been following the rhino for a while, and that they had both been equally surprised to find one another. When the rhino had eventually seen him, it had charged, but it had really only meant to get away. Akimbo now felt all his fear leave him. He had survived a trip with poachers. He had survived a charging rhino. He felt strong now, and he knew that he could make it home. Akimbo was to remember little of the few hours that followed. He walked quickly and tried to keep going in a straight line. He whistled for a while, and he remembered bruising himself against a rock that was hidden in the grass. And then, at last, there was the supreme moment when he saw the lights away to his left, almost obscured by trees, and not in the direction he would have expected them to be. Yet there was only one thing they could be: the lights of the ranger camp. His parents were already asleep by the time he reached home. His father woke up at the sound of the door opening and got out of bed to see his son stagger in from the night. Akimbo, what are you doing here? Akimbo took some time to catch his breath. Then, when he could speak, he blurted out his message. There's a gang of poachers. They're in the reserve. They're after elephants. How on earth do you know? Akimbo told him everything. As he spoke, he watched his father's eyes bulge with surprise. But what on earth made you do it? His father asked, half in anger, half in astonishment. Akimbo did not give him an answer. Look, father, just believe me. They're there. I know they are. I can take you there. Akimbo's father looked doubtful. Then he appeared to make up his mind. He told Akimbo to stay where he was while he went off to summon the head ranger. It was up to him to decide what to be done next. The head ranger listened gravely to Akimbo's story. When he came to the description of how he had taken the ivory from the storeroom, the ranger frowned and looked angry. You shouldn't have done that. You know that was stealing. But I only wanted to help. I couldn't let the poachers get away with it. That's not your job, interrupted the head ranger. It's not up to you to stop them. Akimbo was silent. It was so unfair that the poachers could get away with their greed and cruelty and nobody could stop them. Then, when somebody did try, all he got himself into was trouble. Akimbo looked at his father, silently appealing for help. He has more to say, his father said quietly. I think you should hear him out. The head ranger nodded, still frowning, but when Akimbo told him of his meeting with Matimba, he smiled and nodded, pleased at getting the first piece of firm evidence against a man whom he had long suspected. At the end of Akimbo's tale, the head ranger rose to his feet and rubbed his hands together. Akimbo waited anxiously. Thank you. Well done. And with those few words, Akimbo knew that everything would be all right. Or rather, it would be all right if they caught the poachers. If they didn't, then he was sure the blame would land fairly and squarely on himself. The head ranger now gave orders for all the rangers to be awoken. They had to be ready to leave the camp within an hour. They would travel on foot, he said, as the last thing he wanted was for the poachers to be given any warning of their presence. Can you manage to walk? He asked Akimbo casually. You must be a bit tired. Akimbo swallowed. He doubted whether his legs could carry him any farther, and the sight of his sleeping mat on the floor of their house had been almost too tempting. But he had started this, and he would have to finish it, even if he dropped in his shoes at the end of it all. I'm fine, he replied cheerfully. I can do it. Then 10 rangers set off. They were all armed and equipped with everything they needed for a long hike. Akimbo walked beside the head ranger. Immediately behind him was his father, who encouraged him quietly whenever he seemed to be lagging. He had a good idea of the direction from which he had come. He thought he recognized certain features, the tip of a hill, the silhouetted black against the night, or a stretch of forest. But it all seemed so similar in the darkness, and he knew that he could be quite wrong. Just before dawn, they stopped. As the sunlight came up over the horizon and the sun painted the hills with red fire, Akimbo gazed around, really puzzled. Do you recognize anything? Whispered the head ranger. Those trees over there? That hill? Akimbo shook his head. It seems so different. Everything seemed larger at night. The head ranger nodded. Don't worry, we'll just go forward very slowly. If you see something familiar, tap me on the arm. Don't speak. Slowly, they made their way through the undergrowth. They were as quiet as they could be, but there were twigs underfoot which cracked as they trod on them. There were branches that swung back with a swish when they bent them. One of the men coughed once or twice in spite of his efforts to suppress it. Akimbo was sure they were lost. Should he tell the head ranger now that he had no idea where they were, rather than letting them waste more time? But just as he was about to attract the head ranger's attention, he saw it. There had been a cactus very close to where he had lain down and pretended to sleep, and now he saw it again. It was definitely the same one. There was that missing branch and the piece that bent down instead of up. He reached out to attract the head ranger's attention. That's it, he whispered. That's where it was. At a signal from the head ranger, all the rangers dropped to the ground. Then, half crawling, half running, they moved swiftly toward the cactus. There was nothing. No sign of the poachers at all. The rangers poked around under the bushes. One came across an empty water bottle and held it up for the others to see. Another found a couple of burnt-out matches and showed them to the head ranger. It was now the turn of the ranger who was most skilled at tracking. He walked around the site where the men had camped that night until he was satisfied that he could work out which direction they had followed. Then, just as the poacher's own tracker had done, he set off, following the signs on their on the ground, stopping from time to time to peer closely at a footprint or a tuft of grass that had been flattened by somebody's boot. "They're not far away," he said to the head ranger. "Nor are the elephants."